I always find this spot very humbling, guys, so don't take this as any disrespect, but this panel should probably be called, "Are you more interesting than a sandwich?" Because that's what everyone's lining up for. So the bar is very low in that respect, but so to introduce myself to the folks that don't know me, some of you do know me, everybody on this panel knows me, unfortunately. My name's Dan Marcus. The hat that I'm wearing, or the hat that's listed on your agenda here, is I'm a professor at NYU. I teach in the sports business program. I teach a number of sports-related law classes, including a class called The Business of Esports. But prior to that, in a different life, I've been an entrepreneur in sports tech, and then ended up getting into development and production of media properties. So if you guys are baseball fans, I'm the guy to credit or to blame for having developed and sold Pete Rose's gambling podcast. Primarily, the main business that I'm in is that of being an attorney. So I've worked with pretty much everyone on this panel before on a number of different deals, either as an attorney or wearing another hat, specifically in sports. But that is as much as I want to talk about myself right now. So in order of how long I've known you, Garrett, that makes you the first. Why don't you tell us who you are, how you got here, and what your street cred in sports is.
Yeah, great. Pleasure to be here with everyone. Dan, good to see you. So my name's Garrett Klugh. I've been involved in sports for over 25 years, 10 of those as an athlete. I've worked at 3 different Olympic Games in different capacities in London, Beijing, and Vancouver. I now manage the family office for David Falk, who most notably represented Michael Jordan, along with many, many other Hall of Fame athletes. And
is that the logo that you're wearing? That's who that guy is?
I'm contractually obligated to wear this on every video. Yeah, so David and I work together. We invest together, and I look for interesting things for him to get involved in. And broadly speaking, that's sports media and entertainment. We are active and strategic in everything that we do. So we're never passive money. He has a team that manages that side of the house. But I will put a pin in it there, and I'll allow the other panelists to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're being humble. So Garrett, for those that don't know, was an Olympic rower. That story is probably worth telling over a couple of beers, but we can't do that in the middle of the day on a Wednesday, so let's not do that. And another footnote, he just became a father over last month, so if he looks like he's about to perish, that's the reason. There's tacit agreement there. But all right, those were the footnotes to Garrett. Bob, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Congratulations, Garrett. Didn't know about that good news. Bob Malandro, managing partner in Whitecap Sports Group. We are a sports M&A firm. I would consider us middle market by definition, and our primary focus is putting investors into sports-related opportunities, which of course can mean a lot of things. The industry is very diverse, but where we are highly concentrated is in pro sports ownership. Whether that be somebody who's looking to acquire an asset in minor league sports, or an LP or minority equity interest in major league sports, or even a capital raise for an emerging sports league. That's kind of our sweet spot. And in that middle category, those LP major league sports transactions, we've been incredibly busy over the last year and a half, 2 years, because the industry has certainly taken off. It's like every day you're reading about somebody buying a team or a piece of a team. So we've been in the middle of quite a few transactions recently, and we're finding that that's a serious area of growth with what we're seeing.
Are you at liberty to disclose which transactions for those that like name dropping? Not me personally, but
yeah, I mean, without getting into specifics, I mean, we've put a number of investors into the New York Yankees. We've put investors into the Charlotte Hornets.
Never heard of them.
Yeah, we've put investors in Memphis Grizzlies, Orlando SC. Trying to think what else is recent. Certainly a slew of minor league opportunities. And we're working on our first in quite some time NFL opportunity, which because it's live, I can't really talk about it. But
okay, we'll talk about that offline. Everyone doesn't need to hear about that. That sounds cool though. Well, thank you for indulging with the name dropping, Bob. And last but not least, Mike.
Yep. Thanks, Dan. Hey, everybody. Mike Moran here, sports investment banker as well. Started my career at Citi in their sports M&A group. And since then I split my time between advisory services, similar to Bob, advising buyers and sellers of teams in the big five here stateside, and internationally, a few name drops, I guess, Pistons, Florida Panthers, Fulham Football Club, things like that. And just recently, in the last 3 months, joined a few colleagues, and we started a growth capital fund in the sports space. So all we invest in is sports, sports technology, anything in the future of sports. No teams at this point, but growth capital in sports. And we just made our first investment about a month ago.
Cool. Well, so just as a disclaimer and as a preface, this is meant to be fully interactive. We're just going to see where life takes us on this one. But so Bob, you had mentioned, and I want to be inclusive here, you had mentioned obviously your bread and butter is the buying and selling of stakes in sports teams, or them in total. So we see a lot of valuations that have gone crazy over the last, I would say 30 years, but you know, the biggest and most recent one is the Broncos selling for about $5 billion. And so I always have those like old timey, like 1940s era black and white videos where they're talking about like, oh, times change, we're into wars, and the thing that persists is baseball, America's pastimes. But it seems like from an investment perspective, you know, the market can be as volatile as you want, but sports team franchise valuations continue to grow and go up. Why is that? Is that the truth, or is that just perception? And I'll ask two questions at a time, because more than that seems a little ridiculous.
No, that's absolutely the truth. And that's the interesting thing about this asset class, is it's very uncorrelated to other economic conditions. And you know, I have this conversation several times a day, and depending on the sport we're talking about, but it's a valid comment to say that nobody's bought a Major League Baseball team and sold it for less in the future, ever, or an NBA team or an NFL team. You know, they have never, of course, we can never, you know, look into the future and promise anything. For a million reasons, but historically, in my lifetime, that's never occurred. So these assets have never done anything but appreciate, and that's through recessions, that's through the pandemic, and through the current economic circumstances. To your question of why, it's obviously like everything else, it depends. It's a lot of different circumstances. But media rights are certainly underpinning the value of these teams, and as those continue to get renewed and proliferate prior amounts, that's an enormous factor. When you kicked off the session, you talked about it being the DVR proof industry. I mean, that is also, you know, very much tied to why media rights will continue to grow, because the only thing that people care about live is sports. And they used to say it's the Oscars and sports, but nobody watches the Oscars anymore. So it's really just sports now. And the other thing is this tsunami of sports betting that's coming. And we haven't really scratched the surface on that. Only about half the states have ratified sports betting laws. And I think there's a common perception that sports betting and the revenues that are associated with that will be, you know, enormous ancillary revenue streams that have never been tapped into before. So, you know, as values go up, people are kind of betting on the come. They're expecting those things to kick in and create a long bullish outlook for professional sports teams.
So I'll just push back on one thing. If celebrities keep assaulting each other at the Oscars, I think the Oscars are about to make a comeback. But like, I'm not sure whether that trend will continue. So let me kick it over to Mike and then Garrett, because I wanted to piggyback on this topic on franchises, and I think you could zoom out on this across the whole industry, which is like, what is the economic case for, you know, buying a stake in a sports team, right? Historically, it's been like a vanity play because there's scarcity, and you know, every very wealthy person would love to have their own sports team, right? Like we saw how excited Steve Ballmer got when he bought the Clippers, and it's fun. But like, what is the economic case for it then and now? And why don't we start with you, Mike?
Yeah, I think you know, one of the economic cases, like Bob mentioned, is they've only ever historically gone up. It's uncorrelated to the rest of the market. So if you want to diversify your portfolio, it's a very good place to park some money. There's some major tax benefits to owning a piece of a franchise, the depreciation is very tax advantageous. And I think one of the more recent trends that we've seen over the last 2 years of part of the concern of folks is, hey, as these franchises get worth more and more, especially if I own an LP stake, how do I ever get out? Is someone actually ever going to pay $200 million, pick a number for a small stake? And what we've seen with large private equity institutional capital coming into the space, funds like Arctos or even CVC putting more money into the space, that has just been driving valuations that much higher, because there's just more and more bidders for either the control stakes or the LP stakes.
Garrett, what about you? Or did we fish out this pond?
No, look, I think it's funny that you brought up Ballmer, because, in 2014, I think everyone thought that he severely overpaid for the Clippers. Like, I think everyone thought he was just out of his mind. And now you look 8 years later, and the Portland Trailblazers are going to go on the block for over $2 billion. Right. And Paul Allen bought them in '88 for $80 million. Right. So you just look at these things, and, what Bob said and what Michael said is, the capital appreciation connected to media rights has largely been driving the value. And the question that everyone asks is like, how long can this continue to go? Right. And if you said, 20 years ago, it'll never survive, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and lots of people have been wrong. And, with changing patterns of viewing behavior and sports consumption, is there a point at which the growth slows down or starts to plateau a little bit? I'm not sure, but I think we're experiencing the largest generational shift in sports consumption that we've ever seen. It's a matter of how, these teams and properties can capitalize on it and continue to monetize it to the same degree that they've been able to.
So Bob, one of the things that I think you've seen firsthand is that even like some of the more wealthy people among us are sort of frustrated at the ticket price of buying an NFL franchise or an NBA team, right? Like I worked this hard and I amassed this much money, and I can't even afford to do this myself without consuming my entire net worth. So what are, and I obviously we've seen some of the different leagues, and we could probably rattle them off, but I'll start with you. What are some of the opportunities that aren't necessarily, $1 billion plus ticket prices in sports in terms of franchises that are trending upwards, that are, interesting enough to consider getting in, whether it's an LP stake or even, writing a ticket for the whole thing?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, because I have conversations on a regular basis with people kind of come at it from the same perspective, where they look at the way that these valuations have increased and where they're going from here. But, and then they have to look at their liquidity and see like, okay, is this where I want to put my money? Do I really want to peel off a 9-figure check to get involved in a significant way? And what they end up then asking about is like, what's the next big thing? Where's the white space now? Because anybody can go back and say in 1960, I should have bought an NFL team or an AFL team at that time, for $250,000. That's easy to go back and say, wow, that would have been a good investment. But, now where's the equivalent of that? Is there an equivalent of that? And, where it could be is, in emerging sports, emerging leagues. So now, as recently as today, you're reading about something like cricket, for instance, which has never been a thing in the United States, is now, attracting a lot of attention. And, that's going to pass everybody by pretty quick, because a lot of money is flooding into that. But there's also other sports that aren't necessarily new, but are carving out market share that they never had before. Sports like rugby, for instance, right? Sports like motorsports is another one. So there's things like that are not fully mature to the degree that the big five sports are, that I think create very good buy opportunities.
What about I do want to pick up on motorsport, and Garrett, you can pick up on motorsport too. What about MLS? Because like it seems like every celebrity is getting involved in Major League Soccer for whatever reason, and I don't understand it. Can you explain it to me?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, with MLS, I think, when MLS became, kind of got, big five sports status, when it kind of got put on a level with all the other major league sports, I think some investors looked at it and said, wow, well, an NFL team or an NBA team, those things are valued well above $1 billion on average. But in MLS, for another, major league sport, you can get in at a much lower price point. The valuations weren't quite where the other sports were. So I think, you can put your money, to work a little, in a higher capacity in MLS up to recently. Now those valuations, as you see, aren't necessarily over $1 billion, but they're creeping up in that direction, especially in the top third of MLS. The other thing is there was a lot of, I think, forward-looking towards the new media contract, the one that was just put in place in 2022. I had been hearing about that since 2014 when they signed the previous media contract, about how the next one would truly underpin MLS values in a significant way. And to a degree, when you look at what was spent on franchise fees for expansion in MLS and Charlotte, for instance, I think a lot of that was already baked in. So that was what was, in my opinion, what was attracting investors over the last 7 or 8 years to MLS.
Got it. Okay, so taking one step back from MLS, addressing the question to the rest of the panel here. Mike, where are the opportunities as far as franchise investments? Do you agree or disagree with Bob as far as some of the, sports that he's pegged, or are there other ones that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to your investment thesis and your risk tolerance. So if you come in and you buy an LP stake of one of the, let's take MLS aside, one of the big four, you're fairly downside protected. You'll get some nice tax benefits. Maybe you're targeting, an 8 to 10% annual return. And that's great. Now, if you're looking to make a little bit more of a VC type return and willing to take a little bit more of a risk, I like the kind of stuff that Bob mentioned. I'm working with a client in rugby in global rugby right now who is trying to be the city football group of rugby. They own 3 rugby clubs internationally. Do you look at what's type of sports that CVC is invested in? European volleyball. Do you look at esports? Do you look at European football, where you can there's a whole different promotion relegation dynamic there, but you can 8-10x an investment hypothetically if you run it right, which it's gonna be a little bit difficult to 10x I think the Broncos is very downside protected. It's gonna be a little bit difficult to 10x that in the next 5 years.
Why don't we, Garrett, why don't you have word on this topic, and we got some questions in the room, and then we'll just let it fly.
Yeah, look, I think to not be redundant here, I think that there are some interesting things that technology and innovation have really, some platforms that have really developed over the last few years that are really interesting to us. If you look at something like the Drone Racing League, which could never have existed, that's got a lot of attention. Will it be successful? I'm not really sure. Do they have broadcast rights? They do. It's interesting for us to watch to see sort of how that evolves. But I think what's more interesting and what we've spent a lot of time on is the electric version of Formula One or Formula E, which, I think there are now more motorsports fans open wheel motorsports fans in the US than there's ever been before. Formula One eventually will have a problem because they can't continue to burn fossil fuels. Formula E, if you believe that electric vehicles are a meaningful part of the future, will be the only showcase for electric vehicle brands. But for us, that's akin to potentially being able to invest in the NBA in the 80s, right? Maybe. And so we've done a lot of work on diligencing a number of assets in that space. We're very excited about it, and think that the championship has real legs into the future and a number of tailwinds that make it exciting for a number of reasons.
So if you saw me laughing, that's because Garrett stole the NBA analogy from me and he keeps using it. So anyway, it sounds good coming out of your mouth. But to follow up on this, for those that aren't familiar with Formula E, you mentioned that it's it's like all electric Formula One. Like what is more, like, can you give us more specifics? Like what is interesting about that? What's the ticket price on those sorts of things? Like what's, like, again, like I asked generally, what's the economic case for something like that?
Yeah, well, I think it allows ultra high net worth to have a majority stake in a team at around the 30 million euro for 100% of an asset, with the spending cap in place so that there isn't this endless bottomless pit of expenses. And so that in conjunction with the scarcity, there's only 10 teams and there won't be more. I think that provides sort of the backstop for the next decade of the sport. I think it attracts a much younger audience, a much, more, environmentally conscious audience. They're racing in city centers. The backdrops are, unbelievable. I'm not here to like sell Formula E, but we're obviously very excited about it and think that, given that they have the exclusive license from the FIA until 2037, at some point there will be some event where, Formula One, has to stop burning fossil fuels. And when that happens, Formula E is going to be positioned to sort of take over. And, the media assets like Drive to Survive have really, opened the door to motorsports racing fans in the US in a big way. And I think that's another example of this appetite.
Actually, I think that's an opportunity to do a quick poll. How many people have heard of Drive to Survive or watched the show? See, like that would have never, and as a result, are you more interested in Formula One now?
My kids are.
Okay, all right. Like this wouldn't have happened 6 years ago, 5 years ago, etc. So I think there's a good point on that. On the Formula E point, shameless plug. I make no money from this, by the way, but there's a race here in Brooklyn in Red Hook in about 3 weeks. If you're interested in attending.
What do they do about the car noise that everyone enjoys?
I mean, I think I'm not. I'm not here to defend it. I think it's. I mean, they do sound like, for those that have been, they do sound like rocket ships sort of whizzing by, which is its own version of cool. But again, yeah, like if you go, yeah.
I'll just respond. Like you wouldn't take a small child to a Formula One race because of like hearing damage, but you could take them and they would be just as much fun to go to a Formula E race and listen to these things that sound like spaceships whirling around the track. And so it's a different experience, but it's also way more family friendly.
So I had some questions in the room. I don't know. Pete, if you want to go.
Question is, I'm a big NBA fan, and I don't think you discussed this, but I hear about the expansion, at least into Seattle and Las Vegas, if you can mention that. And then just another thing, I do a lot of work in the startup space. So I look at a lot of these athletes as almost founders of companies that have had successful exits because they're getting just so much money at one time and they're become investors. Whether you start with the late Kobe Bryant with all the money he made off of the body armor deal, I think LeBron James is now worth $1 billion. He's a billionaire. KD's done a lot of investments, Aaron Rodgers, Steve Young. So if you can discuss that more broadly. The third question you don't need to answer, but if there's ever a fan vote or referendum about a way to get an owner such as James Dolan away from the Knicks or something like that, we would appreciate it. Grew up in New York and I'm a Knicks fan, so any help. I think we'd have a lot of people funding that litigation and would appreciate it. So yeah, so Las Vegas and Seattle, I guess. What do you hear?
You want
The NBA.
You want a Knicks James Dolan.
Yeah, exactly.
So I see what I did there. Yeah, that's very good. Bob, you want to take that first?
On the NBA, on the expansion?
Yeah.
Seattle, Las Vegas.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I ever hear is that it's, going to be Seattle and Las Vegas. The league, of course, is being very diplomatic about it. They're being very publicly, they're saying there's no decision that's been made. There's no timeline. It's not imminent. All of these things have been said in the last 30, 45 days. But all I ever hear is that Vegas and Seattle will be the next two NBA expansion cities. And I don't know why they wouldn't be.
Anybody else have takes on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're Adam Silver, you need to, before you decide to expand, I think you need to be very clear and comfortable that you don't have any franchises that will potentially need to move, that all of your existing teams, that you have stable arenas, you have stable leases and markets that you want to be. So before you expand it, because while yes, an expansion fee of even if it's $2 billion plus, that's really nice because it's distributed to all the owners pro rata, but it does dilute your media rights by one or two more teams. So what's better for the league overall, adding more teams and diluting those media rights, or fixing an arena market issue? If you aren't super comfortable with every single one of your teams. So is it relocation versus expansion?
I had more questions in the room. Go ahead.
What do you think the future of the USFL will be?
That's a good question. I mean, we basically have 1 year full of data to reflect on. I mean, and if I'm not mistaken, they played all the games in Birmingham this year.
Right.
So I mean, it's not really, from what I can see, it's not really a full proof of concept. Kind of conducted the season in an incubator, so to speak. So it's really, I think the ratings were fine. I think, from everything I read, the ratings were at par to what they had expected. But I think it's hard to really extrapolate out and predict what it'll be until they really get their footing in a more traditional sense.
Yeah, I don't think there's any historical examples of a upstart football league taking on the NFL and having failed, right? I mean, as long as Donald Trump doesn't get involved with this one, I'm sure it's probably got a little bit of legs. Other takes on the USFL?
I think maybe the XFL coming back with The Rock and how that's going to fit into the landscape is sort of interesting. I don't have a hot take on it, but
I think the natural follow-up question there, Garrett, is can you smell what The Rock is cooking? Okay, not everyone got that reference. I appreciated that. Marty, go ahead.
Yeah, so, can you talk about players as platforms? I mean, I know that we were talking about them as almost like IPOs or something like that, but I mean, you look at the tennis players, for example, Naomi Osaka makes so many $1 million. I think she makes 20 times more money in endorsements than she does from playing tennis, right? And then you have your NBA players, you've got college athletes doing NFTs. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, my thoughts, like if Tim Tebow lived today and was a peak player at Florida State today, winning a Heisman Trophy, he would already be a multimillionaire many times over, right? Thoughts?
Yeah, I don't mean this in a flippant way, but they're getting good advice. And, we all remember, periods of time where athletes were not particularly, diligent, with their money. And even though they were getting big contracts, and I think that doesn't get enough publicity. We touched on it a couple of minutes ago of how athletes are building out their empires, whether it be, via a platform or a brand or their entrepreneurship or their investing. That is really, that is a real significant development I think in the landscape of how athletes are able to sustain themselves, grow their brand, and keep their money. And I think they're getting good advice. They're surrounding themselves by professionals and not just people they grew up with. And I think they're making really good decisions, and they're really, I think, able to see the big picture and executing on that. And again, I don't think it gets nearly as much publicity as it should, compared to what we've seen in past years. And sometimes you read about a guy that you remember him signing a $100 million contract, and you hear that he's in, not just broke, he's underwater by 80 million. And you wonder, like, how did that happen?
I mean, well, actually, it's not just your NBA players. It's all many athletes, because people forget that most of these athletes don't have college degrees, right? So,
I think Garrett, I think you probably have some takes on this as a former Olympian yourself, and again, another, not to pump your tires, but another footnote is you obviously went and got an executive MBA with a bunch of former athletes. So I think you've probably got a number of good examples, including that guy in your shirt who I was told played basketball at one point.
Yeah, look, so tech investing has become the new car wash, club, restaurant investment for athletes. Right? Everyone's cousin has the next Uber, or the next Facebook, or whatever. So I think that there's been a lot of really bad investments because people haven't had the kind of advice and guidance that they need. Now, if you're a tier 1 athlete like LeBron or KD, you have a team of people doing that. For the other 90 whatever % of people that are professional athletes, they don't. And so they're just relying on just random inbounds, and that's a very quick way to lose a lot of money. So I'm a senior advisor to a group called the Players Impact, which is a community of over 500 professional athletes and Olympians who all invest together, through SPVs, with very reduced minimums down to $5,000. So, the two-time ice hockey Olympian can invest alongside the three-time NBA or NFL Super Bowl champion, and be on the same cap table with just different risk appetites. And I think for me, that provides an opportunity for athletes to educate themselves, to put up some guardrails, and get involved without having to make really irresponsible bets on companies that aren't properly vetted. So look, I mean, when you look at some of these shoe deals, going to the NBA, and like, if KD, I like KD, but like, you gave him 200 years, he wouldn't be able to sell $1 billion worth of shoes. Like, that's a marketing investment. And like, there's a lot of these shoe deals, and this is obviously something that I've heard, from David, 1,000 times, that, they're not superstars. They're guys that have some marketing juice, but the idea that they could turn into, a brand Jordan, which is, the third largest shoe company in the world by itself, as a standalone, separate from Nike, like, it's sort of farcical. But I'm not here to get on a soapbox. I just think it's really interesting, and I think the whole college, that it's a whole different topic that we can get into if you want to, but I just wanted to address sort of the professional side of it.
Sure. Mike, I don't want to give you short shrift, so if you got a take on this, go ahead.
No, I mean, that they've covered 95% of it. I think the only other thing I would say is, if KD and they're understanding the power of their brands and their reach. If KD and I both created the next really good recovery drink, mine can even be a little bit better than his, but given the platform that he has, I think he's going to generate a few more sales in his first quarter than I am. Or they're getting smart, and they're saying, hey, don't give me just two startups, especially consumer products. Don't give me 50 grand, don't give me 100 grand to do some Instagram posts or whatever. Give me equity, or some combination of cash and equity, because I want to take this long-term upside potential, which I think is a bit unique compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago.
So I saw a question behind me. Go ahead. Hey, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, not to switch gears too much, but on the esports industry, where do you see most of the opportunities? What's the angle there, given, kind of the massive rise and expansion of the market over the past 10 years? I think, Mike, you could probably start with this as someone who's owned stakes in esports team.
Yeah. I think we're at a really interesting time in esports. I think in 2017, 18, and even early 19, it was every week you heard about a team get funded, a team raise another round of capital. What we're seeing now in late 21, early 22, and especially as the economy turns a bit, is we're seeing kind of the cream rise to the top, where you may have had, let's just say, 50 esports teams that got funded. A lot of the smaller or even medium-sized teams are still kind of dwindling and never really gained any revenue traction. And the top, call it 5 to 8, are really separating themselves from the pack. So the Yankees, the Lakers, the Cowboys of the esports world are very much separating themselves from the Kansas City Royals, Pittsburgh Pirates of the world. And now, I think esports is interesting. Bob's probably made this argument when previously, when tech valuations were really high and tech multiples were really high, and we were selling an esports team, we would argue that it's a tech company because we wanted a higher multiple. Now that tech multiples have absolutely kind of cratered, we're saying, oh, no, but it's a sports team, and sports teams don't have lower multiples in down economies. So we'll see how that argument plays out over the next 6 months, but that's what we're arguing today.
Garrett, I know you have a few esports investments yourself, or through the family office. So
so I think, we looked really closely at esports over the last 5 years, and we just weren't convinced that the business models were sustainable unless you were a Team Liquid or one of the ones that Michael's referring to, and the valuations had already gotten parabolic. So we looked at the landscape and said, is video gaming going to be bigger or smaller over the next 10 to 15 years? Forget about esports, the competitive side of watching people play, but just video gaming in general. And our thesis was, it's growing significantly. It's bigger than, the movie and the music industry combined. So we said, how do we participate in the video gaming economy, this growing economy, in a way that, gives us some control? And we thought, if we can find the next big video game, we might be able to have an advantage in terms of economics. So we created a concept called the Pangea Cup, which is a unscripted reality TV show that's a competition where game developers bring their games and to be in competition. And at the end of it, there's a champion. And over the course of, not unlike American Idol, over the course of the competition, we'll take equity in the different games, and we'll have a stable of equity in a number of different projects. And the idea is that, like, for every whoever, there's one Kelly Clarkson that comes through every season. And if we can create this bug light that attracts game developers, because there's over 9 million game developers in the world, and our thesis is that there is some non-zero percentage of great games that go undiscovered. And if we can find a few of those, I think we have a really sustainable business. So we're really bullish on video gaming more broadly, and trying to put together this model. And it's, we're fully funded for our first season, and there'll be more to share, in the coming weeks and months about that project.
Oh, Bob, do you have any exposure to esports, or did you just want to punt this one?
Yeah, I'll largely punt it. I'll just say, when it was attracting all the, the attention back, as Mike had said, in 2017-18, we did some work in the esports space. But then now we're mostly on the sidelines. We're just kind of we're trying to see where the smoke will clear and what it'll really be. And so we've not been active in esports for the last, I would say, 12 to 15 months.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I'm not supposed to be the opinionated person here, but obviously you can tell I have no opinions. But as someone who teaches this, all I can say is investing in a team is fraught, because 60% of the revenue comes from sponsorship, and that's very fickle. So everyone's betting on media rights at some point, and you would be shocked, or you wouldn't be shocked, about how little the Venn diagrams between fans and viewers of one game title versus another actually overlap. Like, between League of Legends and Fortnite, it might be nominal at that. Exactly. Really? So just my 2 cents for what they're worth, probably exactly that amount. I saw some questions over here.
Hey guys, Chunmeet, nice to meet y'all. Probably won't come as a big surprise, as most of the guys in the room. I coach the NYU tennis team outside of my work. Just curious what y'all's thoughts and perspectives are on the growth of the racket sports industry, whether it be padel, pickleball, tennis picking up steam through COVID. Just curious to get your big picture thoughts on that.
I think anyone could grab this mic.
So pickleball is really interesting. I don't know that this is a good analogy, but it almost feels like rollerblading. Like everyone's going to do it, and then everyone's going to get hurt, and then everyone's going to stop doing it.
Yeah.
And it's going to be cool for a certain period of time, and then it's really not going to be cool. I don't know that that's going to track, but everyone that I talk to, is getting injured doing it. And I guess it's really fun. I've never played. I prefer tennis.
Maybe that's a function of your age, though.
That's age related.
Yeah, that's a function of how old your friends are.
I gotta say, I'm in Florida. Everybody plays pickleball. It's crazy.
Everybody, I know everyone's playing. I'm aware of it, and I think it's fascinating. And look, squash has been trying to get into the Olympics for a long time. It's a globally played sport. It's really interesting. It's fast paced. They can pop up these venues in the middle of cities. It's really cool. And for whatever reason, it hasn't sort of broken through yet. I do think that squash will have its time. But obviously, like, tennis is, there right now, there's nothing that can compete from the racket side with tennis.
Yeah, Garrett, what's interesting is, like, the pickleball, you've got to play on a hard court. You can't quite compromise with, like, the clay that you can on the tennis court. And so that might be some of the like factors that lead to injuries for some of the older community that might play pickleball.
I don't know if it was implied that you were in the older community on that one, but that's the way I'm going. That's the way I'm going to take it. That's the way I prefer to take it. I don't know if anyone had other. Oh, okay. We've got a lot more questions. Why don't we go here, Ken, and then to Moran, and then Becker.
No answers can't be longer than 60 seconds.
That sounds fine.
So my question is generally, so we talked about expansion of sports. What about expansion in women's sports? Any kind of like teams and kind of the overlap with the marketing dollars, right? What if you were going to look to expand there? What kind of team would you guys look to, and what would you recommend for a family office?
I think that's open mic, but I feel like Bob, you're probably the one that defaults to this kind of question.
Well, I think where I've seen a lot of demand is, of course, on women's soccer and you know, that as a team sport, as an investment opportunity. I would say at least 2 times a week, as I talk to investors, I get asked about, you know, what's available in women's soccer, professional soccer, much more so than some of the other sports that could be monetized, like women's hockey or volleyball, rugby, whatever the case may be. So if you're saying what's kind of teed up the best for investment and growth, I would say it's, you know, something like NWSL.
I'll just make one comment that I think, just real quick, that I think that the next biggest opportunity in sports is in women's sports over the next 20 years. I think that's where you're going to see the most growth and the most capital flowing to. I'm not saying it will be at the detriment to others, but I really believe that we're going to see women's sports finally get, you know, the audience and the capital that they deserve.
What's going to shift to enable that to happen? Like what needs to?
That's a good comment. What's the catalyst for that happening?
I think we're seeing it now. The NWSL, like this, we're seeing it in real time. Like this is, you know, there have been so many, I think 3 or 4 professional women's soccer leagues that have failed over the last, you know, 30 years. And we're seeing business models that understand and that are sustainable, and the attention from media and the associated, you know, value of those rights that are going to backstop. And it probably will start with the NWSL. And you have, you know, major celebrities and, you know, tech tycoons that are all investing and you know, I think that this is the very beginning. I think we're just starting the very beginning of this. And there's going to be some fits and starts, but you know, I'm pretty bullish on it.
Maybe Peter Corda should have another daughter, and she could be a soccer player instead of a golfer.
I think there should be a couple more, but yeah.
What's going on to sport with the globalization? So let's assume kind of things are breaking up in the global markets.
I'm going to say, Mike, you can take this one.
Yeah, sorry, it cut out for a second. Can you repeat it?
What's the question, Moran?
What happened if China and kind of Russia and the US, everything starts breaking up? So each one is going to its own market. You know, the NBA is kind of losing some effect. Local markets in China are trying just to do their own leagues. And
can I rephrase it? A great question is, you know, Hollywood is crashing in China, right? Because China makes its own movies. What happens if the same thing happens with basketball and they don't want the NBA product anymore? They want the China product. Is that what you're kind of saying, Moran? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think if you look at it league by league and you rank them as to what is their exposure domestically versus internationally, I mean, the NBA far and away has the most, its upside and its risk. Is NBA China in and to itself is a multi-billion-dollar. I mean, NBA Africa is already worth $1 billion. But yeah, what happens if another GM tweets something about Hong Kong that isn't too popular and they pull NBA games and the NBA loses their Chinese media rights? That's going to drastically hurt the NBA. But it's also upside. You know, the NHL doesn't necessarily have that exposure internationally. MLB, not really. So it's probably the biggest upside and risk for NBA, for our Big Five, and for the Big Five European football leagues, like the Premier League, La Liga, Serie A. Having the international exposure is a good thing, but it does definitely expose you to risks when geopolitical things happen like what's going on today.
So I have a question from Selwyn, who manages 35 family offices in Palm Beach. Selwyn?
No, that's got nothing to do with that. The Rugby World Cup is coming to the States. It'll be played, I think, in about 8 years' time. What is your view about rugby in America? As a former player, I always thought it was a great sport for America. There's all the violence of the NFL, but none of the concussions. Much less. Is it going to go anywhere, or is it going to remain like a preppy school type of minor sport?
Oh, Bob and I actually worked on a rugby deal, so I think this is probably a good opportunity to plug that to the extent that's appropriate.
Yeah, we're really bullish on rugby. I mean, what rugby has to its advantage more so than what you would call an emerging league is that it's been played forever, right? You know, rugby's been played in the United States for 100 years, and it is very popular, just not at the major league level as of yet. But there are, you know, you don't have to go through the process of creating a grassroots rugby level of interest here. It's already here. So it's just a matter of them finding space in a very crowded sports landscape, right? So there's a lot of major league sports in the United States, and you got to find what's the right time of the year to play, and how do we siphon off, the attendance and viewership like from the other major sports. Like, how would we position it to compete? Nobody wants to go head to head with the NFL for all the reasons we know, but they just have to find their lane. And I think if they do that, there's a lot of room for growth, both in traditional rugby and rugby sevens, which is the format that's played in the Olympics, as you probably know. So like I said, we're really bullish on the sport over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Another question?
I've been watching boxing sort of deteriorate over the decades, and other martial arts sports coming up. What are your thoughts about trends in that arena, if I may put it that way?
I think this is another open mic.
I think that it's the good and the bad is it's so driven by personalities. The UFC being sold kind of when Conor McGregor was, Ronda Rousey were kind of top of their game. It's all about, how do we find these marketable athletes to come and have people watch? I think from a pure boxing perspective, one of the interesting things that if I was a boxer, I'd be really frustrated with is, you put in all these years of getting your face beaten in, and then the next thing you know, you can't make any money because a YouTube star is taking your fight. So are people watching the boxing match because of the sport, because Mike and Bob are two really good boxers, even though we may not be the best, the biggest personalities.
Talk about sports.
Yeah. Another question.
One last question. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, live or live golf and
sure. Yeah.
Everything going on between the funding from Saudi Arabia and players departing and PGA and so on. So I don't know if anyone's involved in that, but any thoughts or perspectives?
So as a reminder here, you guys are being recorded, so use that information as you see fit.
I just think that's obviously a great example of when you have a virtually unlimited bankroll, how disruptive you can be. I think if you go back a couple of years ago and you said there would be some sort of a significant challenge to the PGA Tour, nobody would believe you, right? Where would that be coming from? How's that possible? But now it is, and you can see it's going to get even more contentious over time. And if the Live Tour starts creating their own kind of niche majors that, they're getting a lot of attention, and certainly the top quality players in the world, they're going to be formidable. And, what decimates a lot of these kind of, upstart leagues is capital or lack of it. And it doesn't look like that's going to be the case here.
Garrett, I saw you coming off mute.
Yeah. I don't know that you can put politics aside here. But if you were able to, I think what's interesting is that, this is going to foundationally shift the PGA's approach to their financials. And you might say that's good, or you might say that's bad, but it's an externality that, sort of came out of nowhere, that is going to force them to play their players more, right? And it's going to force them to be competitive in a different way and to innovate in a different way. And sometimes that's a good thing. Now, and I'm not saying, again, politics aside, without that sort of externality, PGA just continues to be the PGA for, forever, right? So I'm interested to see how this plays out. I think that you can't divorce politics in this day and age. You can't divorce politics from athletes. And so there will be a backlash. It's just a question of like, is there a bottom to the bottomless pit of capital? And there may be or there may not be.
And I have one last question. So, thoughts about headline risk with athletes endorsing the wrong thing. And right now, you think about a lot of crypto products, and we're going on our crypto panel, but I'm also thinking about, I think there's a lot of blowback for Naomi Osaka and some of her tweets and things like that. And do people consider this? Because in the family office world, headline risk and what you invest in is a big deal, right? If you invest in the wrong thing and politically it's not right, nobody wants to do that. Do people guide athletes on that as well? Any thoughts? Headline risk, unpopular things, crypto.com, Tom Brady.
Yeah, I think that there's a separation between crypto and Saudi Arabia. That like those are two different things where there's bulge bracket firms that are supporting different crypto assets. I think it's obvious to a lot of people probably in the room that there was a lot of froth in that market and that it was going to have to adjust. But I don't think it was, I don't think that kind of exposure for a Tom Brady or for Naomi Osaka, it's not in bad faith. They believe like, hey, they were told that this is a thing that's going to, be part of the future. The larger question is how does certain headline risks affect an athlete's, overall marketability? And I think, Phil Mickelson's sort of an interesting example of that. I think that there's a few examples where people get put in a timeout. Not in the athlete side, but look at Will Smith. Like he's in a timeout. Like and that happens, right? You do something dumb, or you endorse something that you shouldn't, and there should be consequence. And now it's not always the case, but there should be.
It's fascinating. Yeah. This is really great, Dan. What a great panel you put together.
I think you gotta give a round of applause to these guys.
Yeah, thanks so